The study of Jesus in comparative mythology is the examination of the narratives of the life of Jesus in the Christian Gospels, traditions and theology, as it relates to Christian mythology and other religions. For over a century, various authors have drawn a number of parallels between the Christian views of Jesus and other religious or mythical domains. These include Greco-Roman mysteries, ancient Egyptian myths and more general analogies involving cross-cultural patterns of dying and rising gods in the context of Christ myth theory. Comparative mythology. Overview. A number of parallels have been drawn between the Christian views of Jesus and other religious or mythical domains. However, Eddy and Boyd state that there is no evidence of a historical influence by the pagan myths such as dying and rising gods on the authors of the New Testament. Paula Fredrickson states that no serious scholarly work places Jesus outside the backdrop of first-century Palestinian Judaism, which is not the same as saying Christianity lacks pagan influence. Scholars have debated a number of broad issues related to the parallels drawn between Jesus and other myths, e.g., the very existence of the category dying and rising God was debated throughout the 20th century, some modern scholars questioning the soundness of the category. At the end of the 20th century, the overall scholarly consensus had emerged against the soundness of the reasoning used to suggest the category. Trygve Mettinger states that there is a scholarly consensus that the category is inappropriate from a historical perspective. Scholars such as Gert Rudolph have stated the reasoning used for the construction of the category has been defective. Scholars such as Samuel Sandmore, professor of Bible and Hellenistic literature at Hebrew Union College, view conclusions drawn from the simple observations of similarity as less than valid. Sandmore called the extravagance in hunting for similarities parallelomania, a phenomenon where scholars first notice a supposed similarity and then proceeds to describe source and derivation as if implying a literary connection flowing in an inevitable or predetermined direction, thus exaggerating the importance of trifling resemblances. Greco-Roman mysteries. Parallels have been drawn between Greek myths and the life of Jesus. An early example was Friedrich Hölderlin, who in his Brot und Wein suggested similarities between the Greek god Dionysus and Jesus. Modern scholars such as Martin Hengel, Barry Powell, and Peter Wick, among others, argue that Dionysian religion and Christianity have notable parallels. They point to the symbolism of wine and the importance it held in the mythology surrounding both Dionysus and Jesus Christ, although Wick argues that the use of wine symbolism in the Gospel of John, including the story of the marriage at Cana at which Jesus turns water into wine, was intended to show Jesus as superior to Dionysus. Additionally, some scholars of comparative mythology argue that both Dionysus and Jesus represent the dying and returning God mythological archetype. Other parallels, such as the celebration by a ritual meal of bread and wine, have also been suggested, and Powell, in particular, argues that precursors to the Christian notion of transubstantiation can be found in Dionysian religion, which incorporated theophagic rituals. Another parallel has been drawn to how in the Bacchae Dionysus appears before King Pentheus on charges of claiming divinity and is compared to the New Testament scene of Jesus being interrogated by Pontius Pilate. E. Kessler has argued that the Dionysian cult developed into a strict monotheism by the 4th century CE, and together with Mithraism and other sects, the cult formed an instance of pagan monotheism in direct competition with early Christianity during late antiquity. Mithras. The worship of Mithras was widespread in much of the Roman Empire from the mid-2nd century CE. The Mithra cult in the Roman Empire was a syncretism of different religious motifs, centered on the god Mithras who emerges from a rock. Its closest similarities to Christianity are the story of the slaying of the bull by Mithras. A bull is captured and killed by Mithras when he plunges a knife into it, and from the dead bull grain and plants are produced that symbolize life. Mithras was a solar deity closely associated with the Roman Sol Invictus. Stanley Porter argues that Mithraism took hold within the Roman Empire after its expansion and only reached Asia Minor via Roman soldiers in the latter part of the 1st century, after the basic elements of the Gospels were in place, and hence could not have influenced their essential elements. Early Christian authors noted similarities between Mithraic practices and Christian rituals, but took an extremely negative view of Mithraism. They interpreted Mithraic rituals as evil copies of Christian ones. In the 2nd century, Justin Martyr contrasted Mithraic initiation communion with the Eucharist. Wherefore also the evil demons in mimicry have handed down that the same thing should be done in the mysteries of Mithras. For that bread and a cup of water are in these mysteries set before the initiate with certain speeches you either know or can learn. Tertullian then wrote that as a prelude to the Mithraic initiation ceremony, the initiate was given a ritual bath and at the end of the ceremony, received a mark on the forehead. He described these rites as a diabolical counterfeit of the baptism and chrismation of Christians. Ancient Egypt. Early in the 20th century, Gerald Massey argued that there are similarities between the Egyptian god Horus and Jesus. Following those ideas, in the 1940s Alvin Boyd Kuhn suggested that not only Christianity, but Judaism was based on Egyptian concepts, and more recently Tom Harper has expressed similar views. Harper acknowledges Massey and Kuhn as his intellectual predecessors, and theologian Stanley E. Porter states that most of Harper's work is directly based on quoting Massey and Kuhn. Porter has pointed out that Massey and Kuhn's analogies include a number of errors, e.g. Massey stated that December 25 as the date of birth of Jesus was selected based on the birth of Horus, but the New Testament does not include any reference to the date or season of the birth of Jesus. The earliest known source recognizing the 25th of December as the date of birth of Jesus is by Hippolytus of Rome, written around the beginning of the 3rd century, based on the assumption that the conception of Jesus took place at the spring equinox. Hippolytus placed the equinox on March 25 and then added 9 months to get December 25, thus establishing the date for festivals. The Roman chronography of 354 then included an early reference to the celebration of a nativity feast in December, as of the 4th century. Porter states that Massey's serious historical errors often render his works nonsensical, e.g. Massey states that the biblical references to Herod the Great were based on the myth of Herod, the evil Hydra serpent. While the existence of Herod the Great can be well established without reliance on Christian sources, Harper has noted that Kuhn had expected his ideas to have a Darwin-like impact on religious studies, but that has not happened, and Kuhn's concepts are generally ignored or rejected. Porter criticizes Kuhn's work based on various errors such as confusing the dates of the composition of the Mishnah and the Babylonian Talmud when drawing conclusions. Porter also criticizes Harper's views for the lack of rigor and consistency. Resurrection analogies. The Egyptians had specific harvesting rituals that related the rising and receding waters of the Nile River and the farming cycle to the death and resurrection of Osiris. The cutting down of barley and wheat was related to the death of Osiris, while the sprouting of shoots was thought to be based on the power of Osiris to resurrect the farmland. Osiris beds were common in ancient Egypt and were clay representations of a dead Osiris which when watered would sprout shoots in the spring, thus representing his power to control nature even after his death. Christ myth theory proponent G. A. Wells still sees an analogy with the resurrection of Jesus in the Pauline epistles and Osiris, in that Osiris dies and is mourned on the first day, and that his resurrection is celebrated on the third day with the joyful cry, "Osiris has been found." However, since changing his position on the historicity of Jesus, Wells now states that the personage mentioned in the Q source is not all mythical and is not to be identified with the dying and rising Christ of the early epistles. David J. MacLeod states that the Osiris legend is very different from the resurrection of Jesus in that Osiris did not rise, he ruled in the abode of the dead. Biblical scholar Bruce M. Metzger does not see a direct analogy and notes that in one account of the Osirian cycle he dies on the 17th of the month of Athyr, is revivified on the 19th, and compares this to Christ rising on the third day, but thinks resurrection is a questionable description. A.J. M. Wedderburn states that resurrection in ancient Egypt differs from the Judeo-Christian tradition, as the ancient Egyptians conceived of the afterlife as entry into the kingdom of Osiris. Marvin Mayer notes that some scholars regard the idea of dying and rising deities in the mystery religions as being fanciful, but suggest this may be motivated by apologetic concerns, attempting to keep Christ's resurrection as a unique event. Artistic analogies. Artistic analogies were drawn between Egyptian myths and Christian art from the early days when Gerald Massey proposed his theories. For instance, Massey claimed that the existence of depictions of Lazarus wrapped in cloth like a mummy proved that the raising of Lazarus had Egyptian origins. Porter points out that Christian art, produced centuries after the New Testament was written, could not have influenced it. Some scholars see similarities between the statue of Isis and Horus and later Christian depictions of the Madonna and Child. However, late artistic Christian renderings have very little to do with the origins of biblical texts. Stephen Benko states that some depictions of Mary and Jesus share similarities with extant ancient Egyptian art depictions of Horus and Isis. Egyptologist Eric Hornung wrote that there was an obvious analogy between the Horus child and the baby Jesus and the care they received from their sacred mothers. Long before Christianity, Isis had borne the epithet Mother of the God. Buddhism and Hinduism. The story that an adult Jesus traveled to India and studied with Buddhists and Hindus before starting his ministry in Galilee was first produced by Nicholas Notovich in his 1894 book The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, which was widely disseminated and became the basis of other theories. Notovich's theory was controversial from the beginning and was widely criticized. Once his story had been re-examined by historians, Notovich confessed to having fabricated the evidence. Robert Van Voorst states that modern scholarship has almost unanimously agreed that claims of the travels of Jesus to Tibet, Kashmir or India contain nothing of value. Marcus Borg states that the suggestions that an adult Jesus traveled to Egypt or India and came into contact with Buddhism are without historical foundation. John Dominic Crossan states that none of the theories presented about the travels of Jesus to fill the gap between his early life and the start of his ministry have been supported by modern scholarship. Regardless of the rejection of travels of Jesus, analogies have been suggested. E.g., Jerry H. Bentley wrote of similarities and stated that it is possible that Buddhism influenced the early development of Christianity, and suggested attention to many parallels concerning the births, lives, doctrines, and deaths of the Buddha and Jesus. Z. p. Thundi has surveyed the similarities and differences between the birth stories of Buddha by Ma and Jesus by Mary, and noted that while there are similarities such as virgin birth, there are also differences, e.g., that Mary outlives Jesus after raising him, but Maya dies soon after the birth of Buddha, as all mothers of Buddhas do in the Buddhist tradition. Thundi does not assert that there is any historical evidence that the Christian birth stories of Jesus were derived from the Buddhist traditions, but suggests that as an avenue for further research. Other scholars have rejected these analogies, e.g., Leslie Holden states that although modern parallels between the teachings of Jesus and Buddha have been drawn, these comparisons emerged after missionary contacts in the 19th century, and there is no historically reliable evidence of contacts between Buddhism and Jesus. Scholars such as Paul Numrick have stated that, despite surface-level non-scholarly analogies, Buddhism and Christianity have inherent and irreconcilable differences at the deepest levels. The central iconic imagery of the two traditions underscore the difference in the perspectives on Buddha and Jesus. When the peaceful death of Gautama Buddha at old age is contrasted with the harsh image of the crucifixion of Jesus as a willing sacrifice for the atonement for the sins of humanity. Buddhist scholars such as Masao Abe D.T. Suzuki see the centrality of crucifixion in Christianity as an irreconcilable gap between the lives of Buddha and Jesus. Despite this, some Hindus see Jesus as a Shaktivsa avatar, or an empowered incarnation. Jesus myth theory. Jesus as myth. The Christ myth theory is the proposition that it is highly unlikely that Jesus of Nazareth existed, or if he did, he had virtually nothing to do with the founding of Christianity. The notion that a historical Jesus never existed has little scholarly support. Nevertheless, certain scholars in Europe and North America argue that scholars should continue to research and debate this topic. The origins of the Christ myth theory go back to late 18th century France, and the works of Constantin Volney and Charles Dupuy. The more methodical writings of David Friedrich Strauss caused an uproar in Europe in 1835. Strauss did not deny the existence of Jesus, but believed that very few facts could be known about him and characterized the miraculous accounts in the Gospels as mythical. At around the same time, Bruno Bauer began to propose somewhat similar ideas. By the beginning of the 20th century, Arthur Droz, William B. Smith and John M. Robertson became the most recognized proponents of the Christ myth theory. Later in the 20th century, scholars such as Professor of German Language G.A. Wells and Swedish Professor of English Language Alvar Ellegard produced a number of arguments to support the theory. Discussion of the Christ myth theory has seen a massive upsurge since the introduction of the Internet, and a number of books and documentaries now focus on the subject. Contemporary New Testament scholars who support the theory include former Baptist pastor Robert M. Price, Anglican priest Tom Harper, and Roman Catholic priest Thomas L. Brodie. Parallels and analogies. Some modern scholars have argued that the details of the life of Jesus share similarities to ancient myths and may have been influenced by them. Other scholars contend that the analogies are without historical basis. There are also arguments that go the other way, namely that the life story of Jesus as told by early Christians during the 2nd and 3rd centuries gave rise to new religious movements such as Gnosticism. Volney and Dupuy were the first modern authors to present an analogy between Jesus and previous solar deities around the end of the 18th century. century. By the beginning of the 20th century, John M. Robertson and William Benjamin Smith followed suit and made similar comparisons between Jesus and solar deities. However, these arguments were soon criticized by others such as F. C. Conybeare and H. G. Wood, who argued that the analogies lacked historical basis. In his 1949 book The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell advanced the theory that a single myth stood behind the stories of Krishna, Buddha, Apollonius of Tyana, Jesus and other hero stories. In his later The Masks of God, Occidental Mythology, Campbell stated, "It is clear that, whether accurate or not as to biographical detail, the moving legend of the crucified and risen Christ was fit to bring a new warmth, immediacy, and humanity to the old motifs of the beloved Tammuz, Adonis, and Osiris cycles." Alexander Jacob suggests that the Jesus story was the Judaized, historicized version of a very ancient myth which can be described as archetypal, and Thomas L. Thompson argues that the resurrection of Jesus is taken directly from the story of the dying and rising god, Dionysus. Other scholars reject the theory that the early Christian traditions related to Jesus can be explained with parallels in non-Christian sources. Biblical scholarship also generally rejects the concept of homogeneous dying and rising gods, the validity of which is often presupposed by advocates of the Christ myth theory, such as New Testament scholar Robert Price. Trygve Matting, a former professor of Hebrew Bible at Lund University, is one of the academics who supports the dying and rising gods construct, but he states that Jesus does not fit the wider pattern. Films and documentaries. A number of English-language films produced between 2005 and 2008 focused on the claimed similarities between Jesus of Nazareth and ancient mythological figures. The God Who Wasn't There, directed by Brian Fleming and featuring Richard Carrier and Robert M. Price. The Pagan Christ, produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and featuring Tom Harper. Zeitgeist, the movie directed by Peter Joseph. The Hidden Story of Jesus, produced by Channel 4 and featuring Robert Beckford. Religulous, directed by Larry Charles and featuring Bill Maher.